In the sweltering heat of the Deep South, under the watchful eyes of armed overseers, generations of enslaved Africans were bred like livestock to fuel the booming economy of a young America. This was not just about forced labor, it was about forced life. Hidden behind the romanticized imagery of antebellum plantations lies a far darker truth, a system so perverse, it turned human reproduction into a profitable enterprise. These were the slavery breeding farms where black bodies were not only worked to death, but also so force produced more slaves for the machinery of Southern wealth. Long before the Civil War drew lines between North and South, before emancipation was even a whisper, America had already perfected the business of bondage. Cotton may have been king, but it was enslaved people who built the empire. With the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, the demand for slave labor exploded. But as the international slave trade was abolished, plantation owners turned inward, turning women's wombs into tools of production. Teenage girls were forced into pregnancies, sometimes by their owners, sometimes by assigned male slaves, and children born from these unions were immediately regarded not as sons and daughters, but as future labor assets. Their fate was sealed the moment they drew breath. This was a calculated system, cruel, deliberate, and devastating. Families were torn apart before they could form. Infants were stripped from mothers. Lovers were separated by auction blocks. And all of it was protected by law, justified by twisted theology, and made invisible by polite society. While some Americans debated the morality of slavery, others made fortunes from the backs and the births of the enslaved. But the voices of the oppressed would not stay silent. Survivors like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, and Solomon Northup bore witness in heartbreaking detail, challenging a nation to confront its reflection. Behind every bale of cotton and every coin earned was a story of unspeakable suffering and extraordinary resilience. This is not just a history of chains and whips, it is a history of bodies exploited, generations manipulated, and lives stolen in the name of profit. And it is a story that America must never forget. They came ashore under a foreign sun, stripped of names, kin, and country, 20 souls, torn from the shores of West Africa and delivered to Point Comfort, Virginia, in the year 1619. Few could have known then that these individuals, wary from the brutal Atlantic crossing, would mark the beginning of one of the darkest, most enduring legacies in American history. This was not merely a ship docking. It was the planting of a seed that would grow into a monstrous institution fueled by greed, sanctioned by law, and defended by blood. Imagine, for a moment, what it must have felt like. You have survived the Middle Passage chained in darkness, lying in your own waste, packed tighter than cargo should ever be. The scent of death follows the salt air. And then you step onto land, not to freedom, but into a world that will define your body as property for generations. That was the genesis. That is where the American story of slavery truly began, not in the cotton fields or on auction blocks, but in that singular moment of arrival. It was the quiet start of something deafening. From that moment, the system began to evolve. Slowly, strategically, and brutally. Initially, African laborers were treated similarly to indentured servants, but the promise of eventual freedom was soon erased. Laws hardened. Skin color became a sentence. By the time Virginia passed legislation in 1705 declaring that all black people brought to the colony could be held in lifelong bondage, the machinery of systemic slavery was in full motion. The colonies no longer questioned whether it was right to enslave, only how best to profit from it. And profit they did. The southern landscape transformed rapidly. Fertile soil became fields of fortune. Tobacco in Virginia, sugar in Louisiana, and eventually, cotton across vast stretches of the South. The cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, supercharged the industry. What once took days to process by hand could now be done in hours. Cotton production exploded, and with it, the insatiable demand for labor. But there was a problem. The international slave trade had been banned in 1808, cutting off the supply of new captives from Africa. Plantation owners, unwilling to lose their source of labor, found a chilling solution. They would manufacture slaves. The system turned inward, focusing on reproduction rather than importation. Women were no longer just field workers, they were forced to become breeders. Yes, breeders. It is an awful word. It is supposed to be. Because that is how enslaved women were seen by those who owned them. Teenage girls were monitored not just for their physical strength, but for their fertility. They were paired often against their will with enslaved men deemed strong or virile. These couplings were not acts of love, but calculated assaults. And when pregnancies occurred, the resulting children were assets, fresh bodies to pick cotton, to serve, to sell. Slave breeding farms emerged from this horrific logic, particularly in places like Virginia and Maryland. These were not conventional plantations, they did not rely on crops. Their primary product was people. Young women were valued for how many children they could produce. Men were ranked by how many women they could impregnate. Families, if they ever had a chance to form, were routinely torn apart. Let that sink. A child could be born in the morning, sold by noon, and transported hundreds of miles away by nightfall, never to see his mother again. And the mother, she would be given no time to grieve. Her worth was measured by how quickly she could become pregnant again. This was systemic rape as policy. This was violence with a business model. And yet, amid this horror, enslaved people found ways to resist. They slowed their work. They broke tools. They escaped when they could. Some revolted violently, as Nat Turner did in 1831. Others rebelled through quieter, but equally powerful means, through song, through prayer, through stories passed secretly between cabins in the dead of night. These were not just acts of survival, they were declarations of humanity. Take the story of Harriet Jacobs, who hid for 7 years in a crawl space just 9 feet long to avoid her abusive master. Or Frederick Douglass, who taught himself to read in secret and eventually escaped to become one of the most powerful voices in the fight against slavery. Or Solomon Northup, a free man kidnapped and sold into slavery, whose memoir 12 Years a Slave still echoes with raw pain and truth. Their stories and countless others stand in defiance of a system that tried to erase them. But perhaps what is most haunting is not the brutality itself, but how normalized it became. Entire towns thrived on the economy of slavery. Churches blessed it. Politicians defended it. Educated men wrote volumes justifying it. Slavery was not a glitch in the system. It was the system. And it all began with 20 human beings stepping off a ship in Virginia. This is not ancient history. It is not disconnected from the present. The echoes of those first footsteps still resound in modern America in its inequalities, its institutions, and its ongoing reckoning with race and justice. The roots run deep. So if you have ever wondered how a nation that declared all men are created equal could allow such horrors to persist for over 2 centuries, start at the beginning. Not just with the fields or the whips or the auctions, but with the arrival, with the first 20, with the quiet beginning that would become a storm. As the colony expanded and more ships arrived, not with settlers, but with shackled human cargo, the land itself began to take shape. Wide, fertile plains stretched across the American South like open invitations to empire, beneath the sun-drenched soil of Virginia, Georgia, and the Carolinas. An agricultural revolution was brewing, but it was not driven by innovation. It was built on black backs, bent in labor, drenched in sweat, and often in blood. What started with a handful of enslaved Africans stepping onto Virginian shores became the engine of a brutal economic transformation. The land was rich, but its riches could not be reaped without hands, thousands upon thousands of them. White colonists, many of whom had never wielded a farming tool themselves, saw opportunity in the dirt. Crops like tobacco, indigo, and later sugarcane promised wealth, but it was cotton's soft, white, and seemingly innocent that would reshape everything. Cotton was king, and like any king, it demanded a kingdom and a workforce to serve it. By the late 1700s, as European demand for cotton exploded and northern textile mills roared to life, the American South saw its golden opportunity. But cotton is no easy crop. Before Eli Whitney's cotton gin revolutionized how it was processed. It took a full day's labor to clean a single pound of cotton by hand. After the gin, production soared, but so did the need for more pickers. And that meant one thing: more slaves. Fields expanded. Plantations multiplied. What once were family farms became sprawling slave labor empires. Picture it. Rows upon rows of cotton stretching to the horizon, overseen by white men on horseback and filled with the rhythmic, silent suffering of hundreds of enslaved workers moving in tandem, fingers torn raw from the bowls, backs bent in a posture learned young and never outgrown. The demand was relentless. Cotton fed the North's factories. It filled the ships bound for England. It was traded on Wall Street. It clothed the wealthy, padded the pockets of merchants, and graced the wheels of politics. Entire towns flourished around its banks, ports, railroads, all drawing power from the same source. The enslaved. But the labor required was not just brutal, it was generational. Slavery was not designed to burn through one life and be done with it. It was designed to recycle, to reproduce, to grow. Every child born into bondage was another cog in the machine. And as the international slave trade came to a legal end in 1808, enslavers did not question whether slavery should end, they simply found new ways to sustain it. That is when the breeding farms emerged not as a sudden horror, but as an extension of the logic already in place. If cotton demanded labor, and labor could no longer be imported, then labor had to be bred. It was an industry built on the commodification of birth itself. Teenage girls were tracked like livestock for their fertility. Young boys were evaluated for strength and endurance before puberty. Pairings were arranged not in secrecy but by force, sometimes through brutal rape, sometimes under threat of violence, sometimes through reward systems designed to manipulate compliance. Owners celebrated the birth of new assets, not with lullabies, but with ledgers. A child was not a child. It was inventory. Let that reality sink in. On some plantations, enslaved women were expected to bear a child every 2 to 3 years. These were not families, they were factories. The very act of motherhood was stolen, repurposed into a production strategy. If a woman resisted, she faced beatings or worse. If she bonded too closely with her children, they could be sold away. Emotional detachment became a survival tactic. Hope was a liability. Still, the system needed more than reproduction. It needed relentless output. From sunrise to long after sunset, enslaved people toiled in the fields stripped of their names, their pasts, and often their health. In Louisiana sugarcane plantations, the work was even more punishing. The climate was hotter, the crop more dangerous, the conditions almost inhuman. And yet, the profits soared. By 1860, the American South was producing 75% of the world's cotton. And slavery had become a $3 billion industry, more valuable than all the banks, railroads, and factories in the nation combined. What makes this story more harrowing is not just the scale, but the silence that surrounded it. For every abolitionist raising their voice, there were dozens of politicians, preachers, and businessmen defending the system as natural or ordained. Slavery was woven not only into the economy but into the culture. The wealth it produced became invisible to those who benefited from it most. But the enslaved knew better. They felt the weight of every harvest. They bore the scars, physical and psychological. And yet, They endured. They sang in the fields songs that masked messages of escape. They whispered stories by firelight, preserving fragments of lost homelands. They prayed, not to be spared suffering, but to remain whole in spirit, because even if their bodies were broken, their humanity would not be surrendered. And so the cotton fields of the South, the sugarcane rows of Louisiana, and the breeding farms of Virginia were not just sites of labor. They were battlegrounds of identity, places where the enslaved refused to become what the system demanded. They were more than property. They were people, and they remembered. The booming demand for cotton and sugar did not just build an economy. It built a machine that ground generations into dust, that turned life itself into profit. And behind every bale, behind every brick in every mansion, there was a story like this, aching, unfinished, and still echoing. The fields were growing, the profits swelling, and the black bodies were breaking. Yet even as the plantation economy ballooned, there remained one glaring problem for the white landowning elite: control. The enslaved vastly outnumbered the masters in some regions. Whispers of rebellion echoed through the trees. Some escaped into the night. Others resisted in subtle but powerful ways. And while profit may have been the foundation of American slavery, fear became its mortar. It was not enough to own a person for a season. The system demanded permanence across lifetimes, across bloodlines. So the lawmakers answered. In 1705, the Virginia General Assembly passed a statute that would become one of the cornerstones of American slavery. It declared that all non-Christian servants brought into the colony were to be enslaved for life. More than that, it passed slavery through the blood. If your mother was a slave, so were you. No matter your father, no matter your faith, no matter your soul. That one law, crafted in polished halls far from the cotton rows, turned a system of labor into a machinery of inheritance. It chained not only individuals, but generations. Enslavement was now embedded in the womb. From the moment a child's first cry broke the air, their fate was sealed not by their actions, but by their ancestry. And with that, America became something even more terrifying. A nation not simply with slaves, but a slave society. Every law that followed would reinforce this new reality. Slave codes were enacted to control every aspect of black life: what time they could gather, what they could wear, whether they could read, where they could walk, whom they could love. To be black in this system was not just to be owned, it was to be governed, surveilled, and punished into silence. This legal architecture was not hidden. It was public, proud, and precise. White colonists could now pass on land, wealth, and power to their children while passing on bondage to the children of the enslaved. The very structure of American inheritance split along racial lines. Legacy for one, captivity for the other. Picture a young black girl born in Virginia in 1710. She never chose this world, yet she was born into it already condemned. Her mother picks tobacco from sunup to sundown. Her father may be a fellow slave, or he may be the white man who owns them both. That child will never know freedom. She won't be taught to read, because teaching slaves to read is now illegal. She won't be allowed to marry without permission, though her body will be used at will. And when she is old enough, often barely in her teens, she too will bear children. Not for love, not for family, but for the system. The 1705 law and others like it did not merely codify slavery, they mechanized it. Plantation owners did not need ships to import labor anymore. Their labor was reproducing itself. This was not just ownership, it was biological colonization. A womb became a field. A child became inventory. And still, despite the chains tightening with each generation, the enslaved refused to disappear into silence. They remembered names. They told stories, many in whispers, of ancestors, gods, lost languages, and stolen homelands. They adapted songs to carry hidden meanings. They risked brutal punishment to teach children the difference between submission and survival. They turned prayer into rebellion, memory into resistance. Some even dared to challenge the law itself. In races, enslaved people sued for their freedom, pointing to ancestry. Treaties, or Christian conversion, most were denied, but a few, like Elizabeth Key in 1656, won. She was the daughter of an enslaved African woman and a free Englishman. She argued her case and won her freedom. That victory, however, sent shockwaves through white society. It made them nervous. It showed that the system had cracks. And so they reinforced it with new laws like the 1705 statute that made sure no such cases would succeed again. It was never about justice. It was always about control. As America grew, so did this legal framework. In South Carolina, slave patrols were established, armed white men tasked with hunting down runaways and terrorizing enslaved communities. In Louisiana, laws forbade gatherings of more than 5 slaves without a white person present. In Mississippi, the very idea of intent to escape could be punished by death. But the roots were all the same: the legal transformation of slavery from an economic tool into a hereditary, lifelong curse. This system did something even more insidious. It normalized itself. For white children growing up on plantations, slavery was simply how the world worked. Their fathers owned land and people. Their mothers directed maids and wet nurses. Their playmates were often the enslaved children of the field hands. They did not question the difference. The law had already answered it for them. And thus, slavery was not just enforced by the whip, it was enforced by the mind. What began with 20 people stepping onto a shore had now evolved into an empire with legal walls, a psychological gates, and inherited pain. Every cotton field, every sugarcane row, every tobacco barn was soaked in the weight of these laws. They made it official. They gave cruelty a script, injustice a procedure. The 1705 Virginia Statute may seem like just one document in a long line of colonial decrees, but its shadow stretched far. It defined lives, it defined deaths, and it ensured that the nightmare of one generation would be born again and again, cradled not in freedom, but in chains. And yet, somehow, even in that darkness, the enslaved held on to something unbreakable: their humanity. The law could dictate their status. It could steal their rights. But it could not kill the will to live, to love, to resist, to remember. And it is that memory, that flame, that still flickers in the American soul today. In the closing years of the 18th century, a young inventor named Eli Whitney changed the world with a handful of wood, wire, and iron. He was not a slaveholder. He did not own a plantation. He may not have fully grasped what his invention would unleash. But in 1793, when he introduced the cotton ginner machine that could separate cotton fibers from seeds faster than any human hand, the Southern economy ignited. And with it, slavery was reborn with a new, ferocious hunger. Before Whitney's cotton gin, the crop was labor-intensive, almost tedious in its inefficiency. The sticky seeds had to be plucked one by one, making large-scale cotton farming impractical. Slavery, while present, had not yet taken over the southern landscape with the all-consuming force it soon would. But with the cotton gin, everything changed. What once took days could now be done in hours. Cotton became the miracle crop, the white gold of the South, and the Deep South, with its vast untouched lands stretching from Georgia to Texas, suddenly became the perfect canvas for an economic empire. Yet every revolution has a price. The cotton gin did not make slavery obsolete. It did the opposite. It made it indispensable. In the wake of Whitney's invention, demand for cotton skyrocketed in the North and across the Atlantic. Textile mills in Britain and New England could not get enough. But cotton did not plant itself. It did not water, pick, or gin itself. The machine may have replaced part of the process, but it could not replace the people, and those people, in the eyes of the Southern planter class, were to be bought, bred, and broken. Across the deep South, the landscape transformed, swamps were drained, trees were cleared, massive plantations sprung up like weeds, and with them came a tide of chained humanity. Men, women, and children marched hundreds of miles in coffles, bought and sold at auction blocks, shipped like livestock to fuel the boom. The term King Cotton was not just a slogan. It was a system, a regime, one with whips instead of laws, chains instead of borders. Whitney's cotton gin may have been a tool of mechanical innovation, but it became the linchpin of human exploitation. Virginia, once the center of tobacco cultivation, became the nation's breeding ground, its slave farms feeding the expanding plantations of Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. Families were torn apart not because of war or disease, but because a machine had made it profitable. Children were sold south. Wives were separated from husbands. Young men were valued not just for strength in the field, but for their ability to reproduce labor. The numbers speak a brutal truth. In 1790, there were fewer than 700,000 enslaved people in the United States. By 1860, that number had ballooned to nearly 4 million. Cotton alone accounted for more than half of the nation's exports, and every pound of it carried a human cost measured in lashings, in lost childhoods, in generations condemned to fields they would never escape. But perhaps the most terrifying part was how fast it all happened. Within just a few decades of the cotton gin's invention, the Deep South had become a fortress of slavery. Towns like Natchez, Vicksburg, and Montgomery grew rich overnight. Southern aristocrats built grand mansions with porches overlooking the misery that funded them. Banks offered loans against slave property. Newspapers ran ads for runaways next to notices of cotton prices. The church, the state, the economy, they all bent to serve the same master. And yet, the enslaved endured. They picked the cotton under a scorching sun, fingers blistered and bleeding. They sang to keep rhythm, their voices floating across the field, songs with hidden meanings, songs of sorrow, defiance, and hope. They buried their dead quietly and named their children proudly, even when they knew those names might be erased by a sales receipt. They prayed not just for salvation, but for liberation, because even in a world reshaped by a machine, their spirits remained unyielding. It is a bitter irony. An invention designed to reduce labor became the catalyst for its most monstrous expansion. Whitney likely did not foresee the scale of devastation his device would contribute to, but intention did not matter. The cotton gin unlocked a system that devoured lives and called it progress. By the mid-1800s, slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was the beating heart of American capitalism. The cotton it produced clothed the world. It enriched the North as much as the South. Railroads, ports, insurance firms, even the Ivy League universities benefited from its proceeds. It was not confined to dusty fields in Alabama. It was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. So when we talk about the invention of the cotton gin, we are not just talking about gears and pulleys. We are talking about how a single machine amplified a nation's darkest impulse, how an idea turned into infrastructure, and how human suffering was industrialized for the sake of convenience and profit. Eli Whitney might have believed he was simplifying agriculture, but what he truly did was give slavery a second life, faster, wider, and far more cruel. The cotton gin did not cause slavery, but it gave it wings, and the flight path it created stretched over every plantation, every slave cabin, every torn family, and every soul that ever bent over a cotton row, dreaming of freedom that never came. They rose before the sun, roused not by gentle hands or soft words, but by the bark of an overseer, the crack of a whip, or the clang of a bell echoing through the pre-dawn darkness. There was no waking up slowly, no lingering in warmth, only the sudden jolt into another day of labor that would grind body and spirit down to dust. Across the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South, enslaved men, women, and children stepped barefoot into muddy paths, their stomachs empty, their backs already aching from yesterday's toil. This was not work in the ordinary sense. It was unrelenting punishment disguised as labor. The enslaved were driven like beasts of burden, stripped of any recognition of humanity. From the moment the sun pierced the horizon to the moment it vanished, they bent over cotton plants, reached through razor-sharp stalks of sugar cane, or lifted tobacco leaves under the blistering southern heat. There was no shelter from the elements, no break for rain, no mercy for heat waves. Nature itself became another taskmaster, unyielding and cruel. The pace was brutal and deliberate. Overseers moved on horseback or foot through the rows, barking orders, watching closely for any sign of slowing. Productivity was not only expected, it was demanded. If a field hand lagged behind or picked fewer pounds of cotton than the quota required, punishment followed swiftly. A missed target could mean a whipping. A broken tool could invite suspicion. Even showing fatigue could be seen as defiance. The lash was everywhere. It whistled through the air and tore through skin, leaving welts that turned to scars, scars that never truly healed. Overseers used it not just to punish, but to remind the enslaved that they were owned. That pain was a language they were expected to understand fluently. And yet, for all the terror of the whip, starvation was just as effective a weapon. Food was scarce, and what was given was often barely edible coarse cornmeal, fatty pork scrap, sour molasses. It was not nourishment. It was sustenance, just enough to keep the body upright, never enough to restore it. Mothers often gave up their portions to feed their children, only to collapse in the fields the next day. Hunger gnawed constantly, an invisible shackle every bit as cruel as the iron ones. The places where the enslaved were meant to rest were hardly homes. Cabins, if they could even be called, that were often one-room structures no larger than a shed. Whole families were crammed into spaces barely 10 feet wide. There were no beds, no insulation, no privacy. Insects swarmed the corners. Roofs leaked. Winters froze the bones, and summers suffocated. Disease spread quickly. Medical care, when provided at all, was rudimentary and indifferent. If you were too sick to work, you might be cured by the lash or replaced altogether. Children were not spared from this existence. From the age of 5 or 6, they were sent into the fields as water carriers or tasked with tending to animals. By 10, they were picking alongside adults, their hand just as easily, their backs bent just as fast. Their dreams, if they ever dared to form them, were snuffed out before they could take root. And still, even this was not the full extent of the cruelty. The enslaved lived under constant psychological torment. They were watched, policed, corrected. The smallest joys, singing, resting in the shade, laughing, could be punished as idleness or insubordination. They were denied marriage rights, their families vulnerable to separation at any moment. A mother might tuck her child into the corner of their cabin one night, only to wake the next morning to find the child gone sold to another plantation. Another state. Another life. Even sleep was not refuge. Many worked past sundown, especially during harvest season. When the moon was bright, the work continued into the night, and in the silence of those dark hours, the moans of the wounded, the weeping of mothers, and the groans of the overworked replaced the songs of the day. Some tried to run, a few succeeded, most were caught, returned with bloodied feet and broken spirits. They were made examples of, publicly beaten, branded, or chained. Others resisted in quieter ways, slowing their pace, breaking tools, faking illness, teaching their children to read in secret, holding fast to old songs and whispered prayers. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, was a declaration, I am still human. But the system was vast, and its appetite was endless. Plantation owners calculated everything: how many lashes to give, how little food to provide, how long a person could be worked before they died or had to be replaced. They prided themselves on efficiency. They kept detailed logs. They reduced people to numbers. Profit margins. Production outputs. A slave was worth more than any horse or plow, but a worn-out slave. Replaceable. The world outside these plantations kept spinning. Northern mills buzzed with southern cotton. European fashion relied on it. American commerce thrived on it. And yet, few ever dared to ask where it came from, or whose hands bled to bring it forth. The suffering was hidden behind polite society's lace curtains and whispered church prayers. Slavery's cruelty was not just tolerated, it was normalized. And through it all, the enslaved lived on, not because the system allowed them to, but because they refused to vanish. They loved each other fiercely. They carved out moments of joy in song and dance, in storytelling and shared meals, in stolen kisses under starlight. They preserved what dignity they could in a world that tried to strip it away at every turn. To say they endured brutal labor from dawn to night is true, but it does not capture the full truth. They endured the collapse of body and the crushing of spirit, and still they sang, still they hoped, still they remembered who they were, even when the world insisted they were nothing. And that memory, that defiant, enduring memory, is the reason their story is still being told today. She had no name in the ledger, only a number, an age, a price. But in the corners of those cotton fields, in the sweltering cabins lined with dirt floors and whispering ghosts, she was a mother, a daughter, a woman. And she was not free, not in her body, not in her choices, not even in the silent spaces of her mind. The cruelty of American slavery did not end with chains or fields or hunger. For women, it descended even deeper into their wombs, into their beds, into every private part of their lives. Enslaved women bore the unbearable. They were not only laborers in the field, but forced bearers of future laborers. Their bodies became property, their fertility a commodity, their suffering an unspoken currency in a market of endless cruelty. She could be 15 or 40. If she was of childbearing age, her value rose, not because she would be treated with more care, but because she could reproduce. Every child she birthed meant more hands in the field, more cotton picked, more wealth for the man who owned her. And so, in the cold logic of slavery, rape became business, breeding became policy. It did not matter if she said no, her consent was never a question. Slaveholders chose when and with whom she would lie. Sometimes it was another enslaved man, handpicked for strength or obedience. Sometimes it was the master himself, or his son, or a visiting guest. There was no protection, no escape, no law that recognized her pain as a crime. What happened behind closed doors, or out in the barn, or in the shadows of the slave quarters, was considered the master's right. Some women bore child after child, their bodies breaking beneath the weight of forced pregnancies and relentless labor. They were expected to return to the fields just days after giving birth. Infants died in their arms, from hunger or sickness or neglect, not because the mother did not love them, but because she was never given the time or means to keep them alive. And still, she was expected to produce more children, more property. This was not accidental. It was a system, a strategy. In the Upper South, especially Virginia, where the soil began to lose its fertility, slaveholders turned to a new form of profit. Breeding. Women were paired with men like livestock, forced to conceive under command. The resulting children were sold to the expanding plantations of the Deep South. where the cotton empire needed more bodies to feed its hunger. These breeding farms, hidden in plain sight, were not myth or exaggeration. They were real, and they were efficient. There are accounts too many to ignore of women tied down during labor, of children taken moments after birth and sold away, of girls as young as 12 forced to bear children for men 4 times their age, of women whipped for refusing to submit, or punished for miscarrying a child they never wanted to carry. These horrors did not live in the shadows, they were part of the everyday machinery of slavery. And through it all, the enslaved woman was expected to endure. She was expected to work all day, give birth at night, and return to the fields the next morning, to care for her children, even knowing they might be torn from her at any moment, to smile when commanded, to remain silent about the violations that haunted her. But she did more than endure. She fought back in ways both quiet and fierce. Some women used herbal knowledge passed down through generations to prevent pregnancy or induce abortion, risking their lives in the process. Others found ways to hide their children, delay sales, or escape altogether. Some even killed their newborns. A tragic, desperate act of rebellion meant to spare them a life of bondage. Harriet Jacobs, who escaped and later wrote her autobiography Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, detailed how she hid in a crawlspace for 7 years to avoid her master's advances, seeing her children only through a tiny peephole. Her story is not unique, it is one of thousands, each bearing the weight of pain and resistance. This violence against enslaved women did not stop at the end of the lash or the bedroom door. It bled into their relationships, their sense of identity, their very sense of being. They were denied the right to love freely, to marry without permission, to raise their children in peace. Their families were fragile things, always at the mercy of the auction block. Even the children born of rape, who often looked like their white fathers, were not spared. In many cases, they too were enslaved, reminders of abuse that could neither be forgotten nor named. The plantation knew no mercy. It swallowed every trace of humanity it could. And yet, these women passed on stories. They braided songs into their daughters' hair. They named their children with meaning. They prayed when no one could hear them, sang lullabies when there was no safety, and told their truths even when no one wanted to listen. The legacy of these women lives on, not in silence, but in memory. Their stories, once whispered in slave cabins and passed from mother to daughter, now echo through archives and literature, through protest and art. They remind us that slavery was not just a system of labor, it was a system of assault, of domination, of calculated cruelty aimed at the most intimate parts of life. When we remember the brutal labor, the fields, the cotton, the whips, we must also remember her, the woman whose body was turned into a battlefield, who was expected to survive what no one should ever endure, who held on to her children until the moment they were torn from her arms, who bled in silence, and who, despite everything, kept breathing, kept singing, kept hoping. Her name may not be written in the history books, but her story is carved into the foundation of the nation. She was never just a slave. She was a survivor, a mother, a warrior, and she is still speaking if we are willing to listen. They were watched every hour, ordered in every movement, punished for every hesitation. But even in the heart of this brutal machinery, this vast empire of forced labor and stolen, lives the enslaved resisted, not with weapons alone, but with whispers, with patience, with small acts of rebellion that defied the very logic of the plantation. For those who had nothing, not even control of their own bodies, resistance became the only way to reclaim even a sliver of their humanity. Sometimes, it was as simple as moving slower, a drop out, a snapped plow line, a finged limp that drew no sympathy but bought a moment of rest. Work slowdowns became a quiet but persistent language of protest. Overseers measured output, weighed baskets of cotton, timed movements. But they could not control exhaustion or cunning. A dozen slaves in sync, dragging the day out just slightly longer, could disrupt an entire harvest cycle. These small delays were not laziness. They were a form of sabotage. The enslaved understood the system's hunger for efficiency and exploited it as best they could. Others broke tools deliberately. Misaligned axe blades, bent shovels, jammed cotton gins. Machinery mysteriously malfunctioned, and crops suffered. The plantation owners saw declining profits. They blamed weather, blamed poor management, rarely realizing that they were being outwitted by the very people they believed to be inferior. But for many, resistance was not just about slowing things down, it was about escape. The dream of freedom burned quietly, sometimes for years. Enslaved people mapped routes with their feet, memorized the stars, listened to travelers and traders for word of safe houses and sympathetic allies. The Underground Railroad was not a single track, it was a web of courage stretching across states, carried on the backs of ordinary people willing to risk everything. Harriet Tubman, once enslaved herself, became the most legendary conductor of this network. She made 13 trips back into the South, each time guiding people to freedom through forests, swamps, and backroads patrolled by slave catchers. With a pistol on her hip and faith in her voice, she told those she guided, "You will be free or die." Her presence alone was a defiant miracle. But she was not alone. Dozens of black and white abolitionists, station masters, preachers, teachers risked prison or death to help others flee. Still, not everyone could run. Not everyone wanted to wait. Sometimes, the rage could not be contained. It exploded. In 1831, a man named Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher in Virginia, had visions he believed were sent from God. He saw angels, he saw judgment, he saw a sword in his hand. And so, one August night, Turner and a small band of fellow enslaved men rose up in revolt. They moved silently from house to house, killing slave owners and their families. For 2 days, they unleashed a fury long suppressed, their eyes wild with desperation and justice. 55 white people were killed. And then the hammer fell. Turner's rebellion was crushed with overwhelming force. He was captured, tried, and hanged. But the price was higher than just his life. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Over 100 enslaved people were murdered in the days that followed, many of them with no connection to the rebellion. Bodies were left hanging as warnings. New laws were passed to tighten control. Slaves were forbidden to read, to gather, to preach. Even suspicion became a crime. But the fear in the hearts of white Southerners, the panic that Turner inspired, lingered. They had always known, deep down, that this system stood on borrowed time, that no man or woman, no matter how long enslaved, would accept their bondage forever. Turner's rebellion, like the Haitian Revolution decades before, proved what had always been true. When people are pushed beyond the edge of survival, they rise. Even when they did not revolt with blood and fire, enslaved people resisted through culture, through secret prayers, through coded spirituals that carried hidden messages of escape. Swing low, sweet chariot, go down, Moses. Wade in the water. These were not just songs. They were roadmaps. They were scripture. They were declarations that no chain could bind the soul. They told stories to their children, stories from Africa, from memory, from dreams. They created rhythms with drums, with claps, with foot stomps, rebuilding lost traditions in the soil of their new prison. In doing, they kept something precious alive: identity, continuity, defiance. And when the Civil War finally came, many did not wait for freedom to be handed down. Thousands escaped to Union lines, becoming soldiers, nurses, scouts. They turned resistance into revolution. They did not beg to be saved. They demanded a place in the fight. The enslaved were not passive victims of history. They were agents of their own resistance, carving freedom out of a world that denied them everything. Whether by slowing the work, running through the night, raising their fists in rebellion, or preserving their culture in defiance of erasure, they proved again and again that no system, no matter how brutal, could fully extinguish the will to be free, even in the shadow of the whip. They fought, even in the silence of their cabins. They dreamed, even when the world forgot them. They remembered who they were. Their resistance was not a moment. It was a movement. It was survival turned into strategy, pain turned into purpose. And it is a legacy that echoes, still reminding us that freedom is never given. It is seized, step by step, word, heartbeat by heartbeat, in the face of everything that says you do not deserve it. Even as the lash tore flesh and the fields drained every ounce of strength, something within the enslaved refused to die. It lived not in defiance alone, but in rhythm, in memory, in prayer, in the lullabies hummed beneath a Carolina moon, and the stories whispered by firelight long after the overseer had gone. For all the brutal systems devised to break their bodies, the enslaved found ways to keep their spirit intact, guarding the essence of who they were through music, faith, and family. Culture became resistance, memory became armor. The plantations tried to strip them of everything: names, language, history, but culture cannot be so easily erased. Across the American South, from the cotton fields of Mississippi to the rice paddies of South Carolina, enslaved Africans braided their past into the fabric of a new and terrifying world. They carried West African rhythms in their hands and feet, transforming sorrow into sound. When they clapped in syncopated beats, when they drummed on barrels and wooden floors, they summoned not just music, but lineage. Their songs were more than comfort, they were identity coded in melody. Spirituals, the songs of the enslaved, were layered with meaning. Wade in the Water was not just a hymn, it was a guide to freedom, telling runaways to use rivers to mask their scent from bloodhounds. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot whispered of deliverance not just to heaven, but to the north. These were songs of sorrow and survival, sung in field, in cabins, in secret. They were passed down, generation to generation, across chains and centuries, and they endure still. Religion, too, became a sanctuary. While slaveholders forced Christian teachings upon their slaves, often twisting scripture to justify bondage, the enslaved found in those same texts a story of liberation. They saw themselves not in the passages read aloud in whitewashed churches, but in the story of Moses, who led his people out of slavery. They embraced the God who parted seas, toppled empires, and promised deliverance. In hushed gatherings deep in the woods, what they called hush arbors, they preached and sang freely. Beyond the master's gaze, these hidden churches became sacred ground where the soul could rise, even if the body remained in chains. But perhaps the greatest miracle of all was the family. Slavery did everything it could to destroy black family life. Men and women were bred like livestock. Children were sold away from their mothers. Marriage had no legal standing among slaves. Love was a risk, attachment, a liability. And yet families formed anyway. They married in secret, jumping the broom in ceremonies passed down from African tradition. They gave their children names of power and hope. They raised each other's sons and daughters when parents were taken away. The bond of blood, and often of chosen kinship, was unbreakable. In those cramped slave cabins, families carved out moments of joy. A mother telling stories from her homeland, a father teaching his son to fish, an elder humming a tune older than the plantation itself. These acts were not small. They were revolutionary. They were declarations that even in captivity, they could create beauty, love, structure a world of their own making. A Congo square in New Orleans, enslaved Africans were, for a time, allowed to gather on Sundays. There, they danced in circles, pounded drums, wore their finest cloth, and played instruments that echoed their homelands. It was a rare space where African traditions were not hidden, but celebrated openly. These gatherings were joyous, yes, but also profoundly political. In a world where everything had been stolen, they reclaimed their time, their sound, their movement. Culture flowed through every hidden crevice of slave life. Women wore their hair in braids that mapped escape routes or signified tribal origins. They used herbal knowledge from African ancestors to heal wounds and cure fevers. Storytelling rich with fables, trickster tales, and parables kept history alive even when books were forbidden. These traditions were not just remnants of a past life. They were blueprints for survival. Children were taught early. Who you are matters. Where you come from matters. Even if the world tells you you are nothing. Remember your grandmother sang this song. Your uncle told this story. Your people once ruled great kingdoms across the ocean. These lessons built a sense of identity stronger than any chain. They whispered, "You are not just property. You are someone." And in this cultural inheritance, the enslaved found dignity. They found unity. They found resistance. Even today, the echoes of those traditions live on, in gospel choirs and blues guitars, in hip-hop verses and Sunday sermons, in family reunions and recipes passed down across generations. The legacy of those who preserved their culture through the darkest times is not only remembered, it is alive. So when we speak of slavery, we must not speak only of pain. We must speak also of survival, of resilience, of creativity born under impossible weight. We must tell the story of a people who refused to forget who they were even when the world tried to erase them. Because through every song sung in secret, every story told by candlelight, every child named with hope, they planted seeds. And those seeds are still growing. By the time the sun rose on 1860, the American South was no longer just a region of cotton fields and sugar plantations. It was a vast engine of wealth, built not on machines or innovation, but on human bodies. 4 million enslaved people powered that machine, and their value had been coldly calculated. Over $3 billion, more than all the banks, factories, and railroads in the United States combined. To the white men who held the ledgers, that number was proof of success. To those trapped beneath its weight, it was a cruel measure of the price of stolen lives. Cotton was king, they said. But behind that throne stood the enslaved, whipped into productivity, forced to squeeze profit from soil with their own blood. By 1860, the South was producing nearly 75% of the world's cotton. And most of it was picked by hands that had never been paid, never been free. These hands worked from first light to the hush of midnight, through blistering summers and freezing winters, through pregnancies, sickness, hunger. Their labor clothed the world and lined the pockets of men who would never even learn their names. The global appetite for cotton was insatiable. Textile mills in England's booming industrial cities and New England's rising factory towns relied entirely on southern cotton. Ships loaded with bales left the ports of New Orleans and Savannah, headed for Liverpool and Boston, their decks soaked in the sweat of plantations. And every thread woven into a dress, every crisp shirt sold in a northern shop, carried the shadow of a whip crack echoing from the Mississippi Delta. But cotton was not the only profit. Sugar cane, tobacco, rice each had its own empire of pain. In Louisiana, sugar plantations became death camps, with enslaved people collapsing in the fields from exhaustion and heat stroke. Tobacco farms in Virginia and North Carolina demanded constant cultivation and drying, grinding workers down day by day. Even industries outside agriculture, lumber, mining, ironworks relied on the same source of labor. Slavery was not confined to the rural South. It was stitched into every corner of American economic life. Banks in the North financed slave purchases. Insurance companies insured enslaved lives as property. Merchants in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia made fortunes selling goods to plantation owners or shipping slave-picked cotton abroad. Even as government profited, tariffs, taxes, and infrastructure were funded in large part by the trade in slave-grown commodities. Slavery was not a Southern sin, it was a national investment. And at the center of it all were people, human beings treated as capital assets, appraised and traded like livestock. Their bodies became entries in financial ledgers. Their ability to produce children, especially for enslaved women, added to their market value. The auction block decided fates with brutal finality. A strong back could fetch $1,200. Teenage girl with good breeding potential even more. Families were split with the stroke of a pen. And behind every price tag was a life. A story. A scream swallowed in silence. The irony ran thick through American soil. The nation that declared all men are created equal in 1776 had, by 1860, built its entire economic superstructure on inequality so vast, so cruel, it threatened to tear the republic in half. Politicians argued over tariffs, states' rights, and expansion, but beneath it all lay the economic truth. To end slavery was to detonate the very foundation of Southern wealth. And so, Southern elites defended the institution with increasing desperation. They wrote books and gave speeches calling slavery a positive good. They claimed it was a benevolent system, civilizing Africans and saving their souls. But behind the lies was fear. Fear that without slaves, the cotton would rot in the fields. The mills would go silent. The profits would vanish. The census of 1860 did not just show population numbers, it exposed the scale of dependency. In Mississippi, enslaved people made up over 55% of the population. In South Carolina, the number was even higher. These were not isolated pockets of bondage. They were entire societies built on slavery, where wealth and status depended on the number of human beings you owned. And for the enslaved, there was no hiding from the system. Even the smallest child had an economic value. Infants born into slavery were listed on inventories like tools or cattle. Boys and girls were trained early, molded into laborers before they could spell their own names. Their futures were mapped out not in hopes or dreams, but in crop rotations and profit margins. This was slavery as industry. Cold, efficient, scaled. When Abraham Lincoln spoke of a house divided, he was not just speaking metaphorically. He was naming an economic civil war already in motion, a collision between a society built on free labor and one built on forced labor. And as the war approached, both sides, the cotton fields were not just fields. They were battlegrounds. Today, we often speak of slavery in moral terms, as we should. But to understand its power, we must also speak of money. The American economy was not merely touched by slavery, it was fueled by it. Every yard of cotton, every dollar in a banker's vault, every plank laid for a northern railroad bore its imprint. The enslaved were not invisible. They were everywhere, in the clothes, the sugar, the tobacco, the buildings, the ports. They were America's backbone, and yet they were seen only as labor, never as people, until they forced the world to see them. Until the wealth of the South became its burden. Until the reckoning came, and when it did, it came not only in blood and fire, but in the collapse of an economy built on the belief that human lives could be bought, sold, and used like fuel. That belief died hard, but it died, and in its place, we are still building something better. The cruelty could not be hidden forever. Though it had been the silent engine of prosperity for centuries, Slavery's horror began to rot the conscience of a nation. The more its defenders shouted of order and necessity, the more the world saw the truth of bodies whipped until the skin split, of children sold like furniture, of women raped and bred like animals. And once seen, it could not be unseen. From the shadows of the plantations rose voices of resistance, not just from the enslaved, but from those who bore witness. Writers, preachers, escaped slaves, and ordinary citizens began to speak out. They published searing accounts of bondage. They held fairy sermons in northern churches. They flooded towns with pamphlets that exposed the slave system for what it was, a crime not only against black people, but against humanity itself. Frederick Douglass, who had once been beaten for daring to learn the alphabet, now stood on stages across America, eloquent and unstoppable, reminding audiences that he had lived the nightmare they barely believed. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's cabined northern hearts with fiction drawn from fact so powerful that Abraham Lincoln would later call her the little lady who started this great war. And then there were the quiet heroes, women hiding fugitives in false floors, men guiding runaways by lantern light through forests and rivers, abolitionists forming networks of resistance that stretched from Boston to the Ohio River. But for every word spoken in defiance, the South grew louder in defense. They passed laws to silence dissent. They sent slave catchers into free states. They declared slavery not just a necessary evil, but a divine right, a cornerstone of civilization. They refused to yield not to truth, not to compromise, not even to history's judgment. And so, when the political system finally cracked under the weight of its own contradictions, war became inevitable. The Civil War was not just a fight over territory or governance. It was a reckoning, a nation divided between profit and principle, between cruelty and conscience, could no longer stand. And when the dust settled, when the last cannon fell silent, it was the enslaved who had altered the course of a nation, not as victims, but as catalysts. They had survived the unthinkable. They had resisted with songs, stories, and strength. And in doing so, they had forced America to confront its greatest lie. Slavery did not end because it faded away. It ended because people made it end through rebellion, through witness, through war. And that is the legacy we inherit, a painful truth and a powerful reminder. Freedom is not granted. It is demanded, earned, and defended by those brave enough to fight for it, even when the world tries to deny they deserve it at all.